including the deaths of those we most love. In fact, history is a tide of death, as Bloom sees it. Quote, must be 20 or 30 funerals every day, funerals all over the world, everywhere, every minute, shoveling them under by the carload, thousands every hour. The presence of death is abundant to the point of being overwhelming. It will take another kind of abundance to counter the abundance of death, and one possibility is the eternal life promised by traditional Catholicism, a religion that promises the defeat of death by a life beyond death. Bloom hears the priest say that someone recently dead is now in paradise, but Bloom cannot accept that idea. Quote, once you are dead, you're dead. That last day idea, knocking them all up out of their graves, being brought back to life, no. This mortal world and life in it is for Bloom. This mortal world and life, is it for Bloom. For Bloom and Joyce, quote, that last day idea is nonsense. Hope in resurrection and immortal life no longer works. There's a kind of emotional incapacity that drives the need for belief in a God who can outmaneuver the rules of reality and eliminate death. So Bloom prefers, and Joyce believes with his everyman, that we should tarry with reality as it is, not as we wish it should be. We should not trust in a super being who will promise us release from our dissatisfactions with this mortal life and this mortal world. If we choose to live and love this life in this world, then we need to move past the abundance of death Bloom senses. But we need to do so in a way that does not take us out of the world. Bloom refuses despair, his father's choice, and in doing so, he refuses to sacralize death. Bloom chooses to come home to the world, even though it is a world of time and mortality, even though it is no abiding city. He says to himself in the cemetery, quote, you might pick up a young widow here. Men like that, love among the tombstones, Romeo, spice of pleasure. In the midst of death, we are in life. Bloom is inverting the words of the burial rite, which can be traced back to a medieval antiphon in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. In the quote, in the midst of life, we are in death, is what the Book of Common Prayer says. So Joyce's Bloom is creatively misappropriating words from the Christian tradition, this time the Anglican tradition. While he could stay in the cemetery in Hades, he says in some of the most moving words in the book, to my mind, quote, the gates glimmered in front, still open, back to the world again. Enough of this place. But why go back to the world again if it is a world of death? If the whole world is a cemetery? One reason Bloom embraces the world is because he thinks this life in this world is enchanted. How so? Here we should remember Bloom's, quote, in the midst of death we are in life, and, quote, back to the world again. Bloom leaves the cemetery. He chooses against death, against despair. He affirms the world and life in it. He goes on living. To know why, we need to reflect upon the experience to which these lines are pointing, the experience into which Joyce, I believe, is inviting the reader to enter. To arrive at a sense of this experience, we have to do a little metaphysics and of a traditional sort. Joyce, insofar as he knew traditional metaphysics, knew the metaphysics and ontology of Thomism. As Anthony Burgess says, quote, all through Ulysses, we also meet learned chunks of theological speculation, as well as close Thomistic reasoning. Christopher Butler writes that, quote, Joyce's philosophical allegiances are to the pre-moderns, for example, to Aquinas. For even when he is subverting Catholic dogma, one can feel that the scholastics have at least correctly formulated the categories with which we have to think. What are these categories, and how do they help us think about the ontology of the world? I suggest that we read Joyce's line in the context of the history of philosophical discourse in metaphysics and ontology about the existence of nothing, something, and everything. Aquinas, and then Leibniz, and then Heidegger all ask some variant of this question. Why is there something rather than nothing? How does Joyce take up these philosophical categories? We can see Joyce's development of the logic of something and nothing and everything by comparing Joyce's constructive aims to Nietzsche's destructive aims. Nietzsche's critique of Christian Platonism taught us that if something is compared to everything, then something comes to look like nothing. Thus, the traditional Christian Platonist God for Nietzsche needs to disappear for the sake of the world. Joyce's corollary thought was that if something is compared to nothing, then something comes to look like everything. If this temporal, finite, mortal life in this temporal, finite, mortal world is contrasted to no life at all, then this life in this world, albeit temporal, finite, and mortal, begins itself to look enchanted, mystical, abundant with life. If the existence of an earthly rose is set against the Platonic form of the rose, then the earthly rose's beauty can only look fragile and deathbound, its beauty almost canceled out. This is Nietzsche's point in his Antichrist. But when one compares that one beautiful earthly rose to the possibility that there might never have been a beautiful rose at all, the situation becomes different. Life in this world now appears gratuitous, excessive, abundant. Quote, in the midst of death, we are in life. Life in this world does not look incomplete or even finite anymore, but is experienced as full of presence, abundant with goodness and beauty, a miracle, in light of the fact that there may not have been any experience of life, goodness, or beauty at all. This is the truth I believe Joyce is giving us. Lest readers think I am just using Joyce to engage in metaphysical speculation, we should remember that Joyce makes exactly this philosophical distinction between something and nothing in a later chapter of Ulysses, where Stephen thinks, quote, founded, the world, macro and microcosm, upon the void. Because it is founded on the void, because it is something compared with nothing, this world is a miracle. Joyce also explicitly says in his Lunati scheme that the Hades episode is about, quote, the descent into nothingness that Bloom experiences and conquers. Because this world is the something that is contrasted with nothing, our experience of its goodness and beauty becomes everything, an experience of the abundance of life, goodness, and beauty, even in the midst of experiences of pain, death, finitude, and loss. This is Joyce's vision of what human experience can be, despite Bloom's and despite our, in Paul Schwaber's words, quote, past haunted consciousness of our many losses. It is a vision of the overwhelming nature of life when life could have been nothing at all. Rudy's 8 days of life were in themselves an incalculably precious gift. In some, we see a profound reversal. In the Catholic tradition, Anglo-Catholic and Roman, this life in this world can be looked at as a kind of death. And the only hope is some kind of deliverance beyond this life and world into an eternal life and world. For Bloom and Joyce, this life in this world is excessive. There is what William Connolly, in another context, has called, quote, the abundance of being. Surrounded by death, the possibility and often reality of nothingness, there is life in its possibilities and being. It might sound a little mercenary for Bloom to think of picking up a widow at her husband's funeral, but as a metaphor, are we not all widows and widowers negotiating profound existential and relational losses? And there's the possibility of life and love, even in this world, that can feel like a world defined by death. Again, quote, in the midst of death, we are in life. What does this mean here, except that life and its possibilities, not least for love, stand out profoundly in contrast against the nothingness that threatens us? Whereas this life in this world, in comparison with eternal life, can look like nothing but death, this life in this world, in contrast to nothing and death, looks excessive, full of possibilities. So in some ways, it is just this life and just this world that is paradise. The overwhelming, abundant nature of life, when life could have been nothing at all, makes this life in this world a kind of divine experience. This world is sacralized, sacramental, and sacred. Hades makes a startling proposition. Perhaps we are delivered from death into life, into the experience of enchanted, abundant life in an enchanted, abundant world, an experience that is all the more enchanted for being imminent. Butler has written that Joyce at one time called himself an Echan, and that his work was part of, quote, a revolt focused on a transvaluation of all values, internal quote being Nietzsche's, including the value of being and life of being and this life in this world. Even more, Joyce offered a transvaluation of experience. Joyce's novel was dangerous, not only because of the liberty of form or the liberty of expression of human experience this form stream of consciousness enabled, but for the religious experience it was rejecting, that of transcendence transcending immanence, and the religious experience it was embracing and putting forth and endorsing, that of immanence transcendent. As Ezra Pound wrote, quote, the Christian era came to an end at midnight of October 29th through 30th, when Joyce finished writing Ulysses. Ulysses is a rewriting of the Christian myth, a rewriting of religious experience. Joyce redeems the apparent futility of life by reinvesting our experience of world and life with abundant life and meaning. Ulysses is a gospel of the goodness of this world and life. While there may have been only death, where there might have been only death, only loss, there is life. Life that is excessive, abundant, good, miraculous. As Schwaber wrote, quote, Stephen perceives Bloom as a Christ-like savior, and perhaps Joyce does too, a savior meant to deliver us from our temptation to despair in and reject this life in this world, as Bloom's father did through suicide, because it is so shadowed by death. Joyce's great biographer, Richard Ellman, agrees, quote, in Ulysses, Joyce offered a world and did not shrink from calling it spiritual. Joyce offers his vision of an enchanted world, a world where there is something rather than nothing, and therefore a world where something can appear as everything. A vision that can save us from despairing in this life, in this world. A vision of the divine character of immanence. This divinity of immanence in Ulysses is the real meaning of what Peter Gay calls, quote, this declaration of love to life. The paradox is that, as Burgess puts it, quote, Joyce accepts the world as it is, in all its ordinary life, beauty, and goodness, because life is divine and abundant in goodness and beauty and life amid life's tragedies and disappointments, because there might have been no goodness or beauty at all, of life at all, or life at all. So while Schwaber can write that, quote, not much happens in Ulysses, we can say in another sense that everything changes in Ulysses, because our whole framework for seeing and experiencing the world and life in it changes. Joyce accepts the world as it is, but helps us see this as it is differently. In conclusion, I have tried to suggest that Joyce wrote within the terms of a kind of Thomistic grammar, something and nothing, that Joyce inflects with a post-Christian, even Nietzschean spirit. Yet perhaps to Joyce's surprise, the miracle of the world may not, after all, be completely irreconcilable with a kind of Catholic orthodoxy. The world, just because it is something rather than nothing, is miraculous and abundant. And does this abundance really rule out another miracle and abundance beyond it as well? A world Joyce himself was no longer sure he himself could see? That question remains for another time. Thank you.
Shall I start? Hi, I'm Freya, and I'm a PhD student at Dublin City University, and my thesis explores Jewish-Christian reconciliation in Yiddish author Sholem Asch's fiction. Now, Asch was a prolific author who wrote numerous plays, short stories, and novels, and the thread of Jewish-Christian bonhomie runs through many of them. So the paper focuses on one of the novels, The Nazarene, perhaps the most significant one as far as his ideas of reconciliation are concerned, to understand how he expresses such ideas through fiction. Before I talk about the novel, it is necessary to say a bit about Asch, because I'm sure most people do not really know about him. Even though he had a massive readership in the early 1900s, he was widely translated and became the first Yiddish author to be nominated for a Nobel Prize in Literature. Asch rarely gets mentioned outside Yiddishist circles, and more often than not, even Yiddishists prefer to avoid a controversial figure like Asch, focusing instead on other beloved icons of Yiddish literature. The Nazarene, the novel which I'm going to discuss, has much to do with making Asch this controversial figure. Asch was born in 1880 in Kutno, Poland, to a religious family. His parents wanted him to become a rabbi, so they sent him to an elite cheder. But Asch preferred stories from the Bible to the study of halakha, or Jewish law. This was the time when ideas of the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah movement, made their way into small towns like Kutno from urban centers like Warsaw and Odessa. And Asch started reading secular literature. His parents were religious. They were horrified and sent him away from their Orthodox community. Asch spent some time teaching Hebrew and writing letters for those who did not know how to write at a riverine port along the Vistula. In 1899, he visited Peretz, who was the father of modern Yiddish literature in Warsaw. Now, Peretz was a mentor to many aspiring Yiddish authors, and with his help, Ash published his first short story called Moishele, or Little Moses. Ash rose to popularity quickly, and despite courting the occasional controversy by depicting homosexuality and publicly condemning circumcision, he remained a household name amongst Yiddish readers. This changed in 1939 at the threshold of the Second World War, and amidst growing anti-Semitism, a modern rehashing of the 2,000-year-old anti-Judaism, published The Nazarene, a novel about Jesus, through which he tried to reconcile Judaism and Christianity. The Yiddish press refused to publish the novel, and it was published in its English translation for the first time. Many said he had embraced Christianity and was now misleading the Jewish youth. Others accused him of trying to appease the Gentiles for a Nobel Prize. As the novel climbed the New York Times bestseller list, Ash's popularity with his Yiddish readers reached an all-time low. Many had hoped that he would issue an apology under such severe criticism from press and pulpit. But instead, he defended his position through two books, What I Believe, which was published in 1949, and One Destiny, an epistle to Christians, which was published in 1945, and went on to write two more books on New Testament subjects, The Apostle, published in 1943, and Mary in 1949. Now, Ash was not the first Jewish author to write about Jesus. He was a part of the movement to reclaim the figure of Jesus for Judaism, led by Wissenschaft des Judentums, which took place alongside what Albert Schweitzer called the quest for the historical Jesus, which started from Enlightenment onwards. While Jewish scholars claim Jesus as an integral part of Jewish history and thought, Jewish artists and authors, Jesus at once other and brother, to symbolize their own relationship with the wider non-Jewish world, a world that worshipped a Galilean Jew, but despised his people. The controversy around what critics refer to as Ash's Christological novels was especially strange because most of his colleagues were secular Jews, for whom even staunch atheism was not antithetical to Jewishness. Scholars have made many conjectures as to why Ash's works caused such a stir, but that is a discussion for another day. What sets Ash's Nazarene apart from other depictions of Jesus in modern Jewish literature is perhaps Ash's agenda of Jewish-Christian reconciliation, which he explicitly spoke and wrote about. Calling such reconciliation his spiritual credo, he wrote, and I quote, "With it I stand and with it I fall." So while other Jewish authors emphasize Jesus' Jewishness, often upholding him as an extraordinary moral teacher, but denying him any divinity, Ash tried to portray a Jesus who was once a Jewish prophet and the Son of God. Goldie Morgan-Taylor, who is a professor at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, and one of the very few people to have written about Ash's philosophy of reconciliation, refers to this as Ash's ecumenical even-handedness, which is evident throughout the Nazarene. Now, Ash's Nazarene is a 700-page magnum opus. The narrative itself is complicated, and it would be hard to explain it in such a short time. It consists of multiple testimonies of those who encountered Jesus, stories within stories, and reincarnated Roman soldiers and medical students from first century Palestine who run into each other in 1930s Warsaw. Broadly speaking, the story follows Jesus through his ministry till his death from the perspective of three individuals: Cornelius, a Roman officer garrisoned in Judea, who is commissioned to investigate the matter of the Jewish preacher who is rapidly gaining popularity with the masses; Judas, or Judah, as Ash calls him in the novel, the disciple of Jesus who famously betrays his rabbi; and Yochanan, who is disciple of the rabbi Nicodemus, or Nicodemus as he's known in John's Gospel. From a literary perspective, Ash's novel is a masterpiece. Through intricate details and vivid imagery, Ash weaves an elaborate picture of first century Palestine, its people, rituals, customs, festivals, and politics, taking his readers back in time. By using the Hebrew Aramaic names for people and places otherwise known in the Christian world by their Latin Greek versions, Ash firmly situates his story within the socio-political milieu of first century Palestine and establishes the Jewishness of the Christian story. I will briefly talk about Ash's portrayal of three characters in the novel, Jesus, Jude, and Nicodemus, to demonstrate how he uses his characters to forward his agenda of interfaith reconciliation. From the start, Ash avoids any certainty regarding Jesus' identity. To avoid complications of the Annunciation story, Ash has Mary narrate the story of Jesus' birth to his disciples one night when they're visiting Nazareth. Mary recounts all the magic of Luke's version of the Nativity in such a way that it can easily be interpreted as the joy experienced by a mother at the birth of her first child. Ash keeps true to Luke's gospel and makes Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem, where Jesus is ultimately born in a stable surrounded by rather hospitable cattle. It would seem that Ash, much like Matthew and Luke, was trying to maintain Jesus' claim to his Davidic ancestry by doing so, since many believe that the Messiah would not just be David's lineage, but also be born in his city, Bethlehem. But Ash casts doubt over his Jesus' messiahship through Simeon, who in the Gospel of Luke and in the Nazarene has prayed to not die before seeing the Messiah. While in Luke, Simeon takes Jesus in his arms and says with utter certainty, "Lord, now let your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation." Ash's Simeon leaves space for reasonable doubt when he says, "It may be that this is the Messiah. I thank thee, Lord, that I have seen the helper of Israel." While his secondary characters are exceptionally well developed, Ash's Jesus suffers the brunt of his ecumenical even-handedness. Ash tries to portray a Jesus both Christians and Jews can identify with. Therefore, he grapples to reconcile Jesus, the Jewish prophet, with the Christ of Christianity, resulting in a Yeshua whose true nature remains unclear. Perhaps it is only fitting that it be so. A singular interpretation would barely do justice to the 2,000 years of historical experience. His effort to maintain this delicate balance does not let him stray from the gospel narratives, but Ash situates every teaching and action of Jesus within the wider Jewish intellectual and religious discourse of first century Palestine, especially among the Pharisees, to illustrate his connectedness to Jewish faith and culture as important to the interpretation of Christian meaning. So while Ash's Jesus seems to almost quote the New Testament Jesus verbatim, he also recites the Shema wrapped in a Jewish prayer shawl and dies for Kiddush Hashem, bringing to mind the martyrdom of 10 rabbis at the hands of Rome, which is detailed in Midrash Ele Kara, recited every Yom Kippur. It is Ash's Nicodemus, a staunch Hillelite rabbi, who defends Jesus every step of the way, thus providing the readers with justifications from within the Jewish tradition for everything Jesus does that has been interpreted in the Christian tradition as Jesus opposing Judaism itself. It is Ash's Nicodemus who explains the crux of the disputes between Jesus and the other rabbis. He says, and I quote, "The words of both the rabbi of Galilee and of the sages are the words of the living God. For the ways of the scholars and the learned are different from those of the Galilean. But every dispute which arises in the name of heaven and of heavenly purposes must in the end be adjusted in peace." For Ash, it is the words of the living God, common to both Jewish and Christian traditions, that form the core of the Judeo-Christian ideal, binding the two faiths together in peace. Through Nicodemus, Ash also challenges the image of Pharisees perpetuated within Christianity as an excessively legalistic, homogeneous group who are too obsessed with the law to appreciate the true spirit of things. In this, Ash is inspired by Jewish historians like Abraham Geiger, who in the 19th century situated Jesus as an integral part of the Pharisaic tradition, and as a precursor to more moderns like E.P. Sanders and David Flusser, who have contributed to more nuanced understanding of Second Temple Judaism. Ash's philosophy of reconciliation also finds reflection in the works of scholars engaged in Jewish-Christian dialogue like Franz Rosenzweig and Gregory Baum. The other such stereotype of the Jewish people that Ash attempts to address through the novel is that of Judah. Ash lamented in his book, What I Believe, how out of the 12, and I quote, "out of the 12 disciples, all Jews, all but one faithful followers of Jesus, only Judas, the unfaithful, became to Christians the symbol of the Jewish people. In the Nazarene, Judas is neither the thieving Judas of John's Gospel who cares not for the poor and steals from the communal money bag, nor is he the greedy backstabber of Matthew who betrays his rabbi for the love of money. He is one of the more learned of Jesus' disciples and is delirious with messianic expectations, but is also plagued by a profound skepticism that makes him somewhat of a contradiction. It is his impatience over the lack of action against Rome on Jesus' part, especially if he's truly the Messiah, that propels him to take matters in his own hands. Judah clearly believes that by setting events in motion, leading to the fulfillment of prophecies about the Son of Man and his sufferings, he's hastening the deliverance. And perhaps when faced with execution, Jesus would be forced to reveal his true identity as the Messiah. Ash's Judah seems to be a representative of the rabbinical Jews of Jesus' time, frustrated with Rome, impatient for deliverance, educated in the Torah, full of inquiry and necessarily doubt. The contradictions of Judah's character in the Nazarene are in keeping with his paradoxical role in the New Testament. And I quote, "And truly the Son of Man goes as it was determined, but woe to the man by whom he's betrayed." He's essential to the plan of redemption and yet condemned. 2 nights before the Passover feast, Ash's Judah, unable to sleep in peace, berates himself for his impatience and asks God, "Why hast thou chosen me alone from among all to be the accursed one? Why hast thou lit in me the fire, which is the thirst for salvation?" And in that moment, he seems to become aware of his role in the plan of redemption, the one without which his tormented soul would find no repose. And I quote, "Like the scapegoat, I shall be shattered on the rocks, but these will be the everlasting rocks of the unborn generations. Yet I will do it for the sake of redemption. Without me, it cannot come." With that, Judah becomes the ground zero for generations of Jews who will suffer slurs, torture, and ignominious deaths for betrayal and deicide, and an entire people, Jesus' own, to whom he was born, amidst whom he was raised, lived, and preached, would be denied his rightful portion in his story. As Judah continues, he says, "More than all the others, I will bleed with every bloody wound of his. I will fling my body under the lashes of the wicked as they fall upon him. I shall groan with every groan of his. I shall cry out with his cry." Drawing a prophetic parallel between Jesus' sufferings with that of the suffering Jewry for generations to come. Despite a shadowy Jesus, Ash never loses sight of his ecumenical philosophy. And in that sense, he's successful in imparting through literature his message of reconciliation. Ash saw Christianity as a new power, born of Judaism, but with the potential to embrace the whole world. The way in which Judaism, in its given narrow nationalistic, that's actually his words, not mine, form could not. And Jesus to him is the manifestation of the highest ideals of humanity, shared by both Jews and Christians: love for God, striving for righteousness, respect for human life, and struggle for a better world. By appealing to the common heritage shared by both communities, Ash not only reminded Christian anti-Semites about the origin of their own faith and the values they were expected to uphold, but also tried to bring the two faiths to a place of dialogue where each could receive each other's experience with a willingness to be shared by the other's otherness. It should also be noted that this novel was published at a time when efforts to de-Judaize Christianity were afoot by the Institute for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence on German Religious Life. So in that context, Ash's novel is a revolutionary statement. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jeff and Freya, for your presentations. Okay, so I figured out that as the last speaker for the day, we probably would be all pretty tired. So I'm going to try and take a narrative form and not go too much on the abstract. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm hoping. There we go, I think. Can you guys see it? Okay. So when my friend Carolyn insisted there was a great new novel that I absolutely had to read, I didn't pay much attention because we were speaking in loud voices at the farewell party I threw in Paris before I moved to Rome in 2014 to teach here. And I was distracted by the humming and buzzing of many friends in the wine bar that I had rented out for the evening. She promised, "I'll send you the novel via Amazon." And then I forgot about it completely, probably feeling guilty about the 15 large cardboard boxes of books that I had already sent to Rome. So when I arrived in Rome, and then a few weeks later, a novel in English turned up at my door in an Amazon envelope, I kind of wondered where it was coming from. But as I read it, if you'll forgive me using a rather hackneyed juvenile phrase, it blew my mind. The novel was Carew by Steve Tessich. It's a posthumous book, which was published in 1998 by Harcourt Brace in New York City. Tessich, who was a Serbian-American writer born in Yugoslavia and then emigrated to flee communism when he was a teenager, had just finished writing the book when he died of a heart attack at age 53 while vacationing with his family. Little did I realize as I plowed through the hefty book that I'd already seen films where the script had actually been written by Tessich, such as Arthur Penn's Four Friends. Tessich was a playwright and a screenwriter who'd won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay in 1979 with the movie Breaking Away. As I would discover, Tessich had a knack for coolly observing the everyday realities and also speech patterns of Americans with a critical, detached eye, but also a lot of empathy. As a child growing up in Yugoslavia under communism, he had fancied that all of America was like the John Wayne cowboy movies that he saw. So he was set up for a lot of disappointment when his family moved to East Chicago, Indiana, which was probably one of the most polluted industrial towns then in the US. And his disenchantment with the US grew as Tessich saw that corruption, consumerism, and loss of freedom were taking over America. Tessich's most famous legacy, although it's an anonymous one right now, is the word he coined, which is post-truth. When OUP chose post-truth as its word of the year in 2016, they traced it back to an essay that Tessich had written in 1992. Got the quote here. Reflecting on the Iran-Contra scandal and the Persian Gulf War, Tessich lamented that we as a free people, meaning Americans, have freely decided that we want to live in some post-truth world. OUP continues, there is evidence of the phrase post-truth being used before Tessich's article, but apparently with a transparent meaning after the truth was known, and not with a new implication that truth itself has become irrelevant. I'd now like to argue that Tessich's novel Carew, by exploring metaphysical themes such as truth versus lies or reality versus a good storyline, in a style that is both extremely comic, but also highly tragic, reveals our lives, what our lives are like today. So both the plight and the hopes of us postmodern individuals. Presumably, like all Serbs, Tessich was an Orthodox Christian, although I have no data as to how much he practiced his faith. To the discerning eye, this novel, Carew, is full of references to the Bible and even to church fathers, although there are no direct quotes. It also draws heavily on the classic Russian novelists that Tessich loved so much and he had studied, like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, with themes such as sin and damnation, or grace and salvation, or spiritual struggle between God and the devil and the soul. Carew is pregnant with a shrewd postmodern theological anthropology, I think a description of what our lives have become, although in an implicit literary form. So in order to make that clear, because I'm presuming that none of you has actually read the book, although one scope of my talk tonight would be to get you to order the book and to read it, because I really think it's a fantastic book. It would make for a great summer reading, just over 300 pages. So I'll try and sum up the book and then just suggest some theological implications, which I'll write about more in the paper. So spoiler alert, because I'm going to tell you what the book is about, but fear not, because even as I know the end of the story, as I've been rereading the novel quite a few times, I actually enjoy it more and more, because I see how the buildup that he makes is really incredibly talented. He's an amazing writer. In a way, Tessich reminds me a lot of Flannery O'Connor's style, but as if her short stories with so much detail and attention to colors and language patterns, if that had been extended over a 300-page novel, and instead of obviously being in the south of the United States, the novel is located in New York, LA, and Pittsburgh. I don't know if you remember that line that was quoted in the film about Flannery O'Connor the other day. I'm always irritated by people who imply that writing fiction is an escape from reality. It is a plunge into reality, and it's very shocking to the system. And I would argue that's exactly what the novel Carew does to the reader. O'Connor added, our age not only does not have a very sharp eye for the almost imperceptible intrusions of grace, it no longer has much feeling for the nature of the violences which precede and follow them. And again, that's exactly, I think, what Carew does, is you got 328 pages of violences, and then the 5 final pages, which are filled with imperceptible grace. So it's kind of, to paraphrase Hamlet, Tessich tells a tale that is full of sound and fury, but certainly not signifying nothing, and certainly not told by an idiot. Carew is an autobiographical playoff, so it incorporates a lot of details from Tessich's own life and blows them out of proportion. The main character is a cynical New York screenplay editor who makes a ton of money rewriting other screenwriters' stories. This is what the character has to say about himself. I doctor screenplays written by somebody else, or he also self-describes as a professional hack with a knack that's come to be regarded as talent. The hack is a sick man whose greatest disease in the first chapter is that he can't get drunk anymore. So he just devours enormous quantities of alcohol and then has to pretend he's drunk because that's his character. He's in a friendly mid-divorce situation from a beautiful socialite called Diana, and repeatedly neglects their adopted son, Billy, who's a student at Harvard. Carew is absolutely terrified of reality and of truth. He has this dread that one day reality or truth are going to catch up with him. So on the one hand, he's extremely cynical about it, and his self-deprecating observation and humor is just fantastic. On the other hand, Carew is a pathetic character, terrified by the nihilism in him and around him. There's a quote here, I lie not because I'm afraid of truth, but rather as a desperate attempt to preserve my faith in its existence. When I lie, I feel that I'm actually hiding from truth. My dread is that were I ever to stop hiding from it, I might discover that truth does not exist. Saul Carew's church is the dry cleaners on Saturday. Here's an example of, I think, his humor. Going to the cleaners on Saturdays was as close as I came to having a religion. It was a chore I cherished. It gave me a sense of spiritual renewal to go to the cleaners. My place of worship was Quick Cleaners on 84th Street, just west of Broadway. So obviously it's typically postmodern. It's a parody of the traditional Catholic and Orthodox going to sacramental confession on Saturday. And instead of cleansing your soul and body, what you're doing is cleansing your externals, your appearances. There's a terrible character in the novel who clearly from the outset is described as a Satan-like character, very sinister, called J. Cromwell, who keeps prodding Carew to rewrite other people's screenplays. And Cromwell relishes the fact this has actually pushed a young author to suicide because the rewriting made it a great commercial hit, the movie, but the young author couldn't stand the fact that his story had been modified. Carew knows that Cromwell is the devil, but he just can't resist his appeal. And then the story turns, because one day as Carew is watching snippets of a movie that he's been asked to rewrite, he recognizes a laughter. We've been told that he's really good at sounds and voices, not faces. And he recognizes the laughter of the biological mother of his adopted son. And so he decides to apply to real life what he always does with screenplays. So he's going to rewrite life to give it a happy ending. He's going to force love to happen. He's going to make things up for his son that he's been neglecting. So he hunts down the biological mother, Layla. He becomes her lover and finally introduces her to Billy, her biological son. And Carew keeps rehearsing in his mind a scene where he's going to present them and more than present them, actually reveal that they're mother and son, but he never gets to that point. He's relishing the fact he's becoming like God by rewriting reality. But things go terribly wrong because this turns into a love triangle, and there's a growing inkling that there's an incest going on between the mother and the son who've become physically and sexually attracted to each other. And Carew cannot deal with that and crashes a car. Both the mother and the son die. And then really weird, I mean, it gets weirder and weirder. The devil, this man, J. Cromwell, who's an antichrist, obviously the initials J. Cromwell, JC, make it pretty plain, has a Pulitzer Prize winning author rewrite the story of this love triangle, and it turns into a great magazine story. And then J. Cromwell summons Carew and says, I want you to rewrite your story, as it's already been made clear that there was incest, and I want you to make this into a great movie because it's going to gross a lot of money. So is Saul doomed? We're now in the last pages of the book. He's been trying to seek forgiveness from other people, from his mother, from a director whose movie he's ruined, but people can't face this. They're postmodern. It gets too real if you ask somebody for their forgiveness. And so Saul Carew's redemption is now going to happen in a highly symbolic, gruesome way. He leaves the father of lies, Cromwell, and rushes to the bathroom because he has a feeling that he needs to empty himself. But what comes out of him in the toilet bowl is blood, and it fills up with blood. And those are the last pages of the book. It's pretty gruesome, but it's also, in a way, very Christ-like. He has a mystical, redeeming encounter with God, and he slowly realizes that God is not at all like he imagined him or feared him, or God is a worker. God is somebody who's joyful, who fights against the nothingness that J. Cromwell represents. And so Carew embarks on the one story he always wanted to tell, which is a tired out version of Ulysses' voyage. Carew is alone but not lost, and he'll be forever following in God's wake, unable to make up for lost love, but now he's hopeful and peaceful on his eternal pilgrimage. A few minutes more now, I'd like to draw some theological and philosophical conclusions from this. The time is too short to make for a lot of justifications, but what really strikes me is how perceptive Tesich is of the flaws of postmodernity: total nihilism, godlessness, post-truth, preference for publicity over privacy, for money-making storylines over reality, for derision in the face of death, incest, and even pedophilia. There's really awful scenes in the book. But to return to O'Connor's quote, Tesich's reader is made to feel sharply the natures of the violences which precede and follow imperceptible moments of grace. And I think so where the reader is faced with a question when you laugh out loud at the humor in the book, am I going to take this as a tragedy as a comedy, and there are shadows of Greek hubris that are there. What's the decision? What's my discernment? What can a man do when his infinite desires contradict his finite abilities? As Greek theater teaches us, if he refuses to confess his limitations, tragedy ensues. But if he takes his finiteness in stride, then that makes for great comedy. So there's a lot here for the theological imagination. Second point is this kenosis, the emptying of oneself with the blood rushing out in the toilet bowl. It is really a Christ-like theme of emptying oneself, of kenosis. And there's an invitation to accept that in front of the fear of nothingness, which is the devil, J. Cromwell. There is the void, which you guys have been speaking about earlier. And the void is not something to be afraid of. God is present in the void. So there's a lot of spiritual wisdom here from the church fathers, also things that reminded me of Walker Percy's Lost in the Cosmos. We're alone on our trip, but in a way we're not abandoned. There's a moment in the book where Carew is in a bookstore and he looks at all the bookshelves and thinks, if God were to come back and reveal himself, all of these books would be useless. I see the other distinguished speakers have a lot of books behind them. So he says all of those would disappear: philosophy, theology, history, science. They would be rendered useless except travel books. And so it's a kind of build up to the end where Carew is on this Ulysses travel, a pilgrim towards the creator through the universe. So he doesn't know what course he's on. This is the last lines in the book, but he does know that he's not lost in the universe. Every now and then he prays, "Blessed be anything that lives, father, mother, brothers, sisters, children of the earth. Blessed be your very lives, for they are the joy of the world." And then he sails on. To conclude, here's the face of the author, Steve Tesich. I think if we go back to the theme of this entire symposium, the call of literature, I think that in this book, Tesich answered a personal call to be a prophet in the biblical sense. So to be able to point out the evil in the world and also point out what is good in the world and call us to a moral discernment. So we've got the author who has a calling. And I think also the novel calls out to the reader. It calls us to see ourselves in the twisted mirror of what Flannery O'Connor would have called a freak, because Carew is a freak. He's a larger than life figure. But the twisted mirror he offers us is an occasion, an opportunity for us to discern where our choices are, where our hearts are, our temptations, our desires, and ultimately our search for God. So I think the literary imagination that Tesich deploys here is a fantastic means to bring us to the ongoing process of conversion to the real, both through the text and beyond it. Maybe, I don't know, in the time we got left for discussion, but that could be a topic of conversation. How much does the text help us? And then like in here, there's a severe criticism of what you can do to a text to make it unreal. So I'll just conclude with the last words again from the book, and then he sails on. Thank you for your attention. So any questions, discussions?
These are not books, these are CDs.
You know, maybe even worse.
Father Nicholas, I was thinking, I wonder, I've thought a lot about the way that plays can be performed, right? You can have, 100 different performances of Hamlet, right? And they can be very different and sometimes, inconsistent. and yet still be performances of Hamlet. And so I'm wondering, you know, where's the line between, you know, a rewriting, right, of something such that you really violate the text and change the story versus, you know, a performance of a text. I mean, there have been feminist performances of The Taming of the Shrew. You read The Taming of the Shrew, it's not very feminist. And yet there have been really creative, you know, feminist performances. So I just think that's, it's an interesting question, because clearly there are readings that do violence to texts, or rewritings that do violence to texts. But there are also performances that can be very creative that I don't think do violence. It's just something I was thinking about as I listened to you.
I wonder if we don't have a criterion for discernment with the writings of Father Bill Lynch, who an American Jesuit who wrote on faith and hope and the imagination after a mental breakdown. So he was in day hospital for a year and a half, and he thought a lot and observed the other patients. What is the relation between mental health, the imagination, and faith or hope? And he talks about the fact that the imagination tends to fixate. It's what scripture calls idolatry. So if you're say like Carew in the novel is perpetually rewriting because he's obeying to the idol of money. That's obvious. It's the idol of money, so that Hollywood can make more money, and Carew himself is really wealthy. So there's a fixated imagination. So people can die. There's the suicide. I don't care. I made money on this. On the other hand, maybe a creative performance, there's something that is intended to defixate the imagination, where it's fixated, say, on like a macho version, like a anti-feminist understanding of Shakespeare's play, and then free that from idolatry, and then open it up to a new vision of the relationships between men and women. You know, like, so the scope would be to make us freer, not to enslave us more. I don't know. I'm off the top of my head, I think of that.
I'll tell you, I have a copy of Lynch's Images of Hope on my desk right where I'm sitting. I've not read his work on literature, but someone about 15 years ago recommended Images of Hope to me as a book about, you know, a sort of theological psychology. So yeah, it's right here on my desk. So that's fun that you mentioned him. I like that book a lot.
Yeah. Freya, I was wondering, so Ash's book, and just thinking about, there are so many other literary authors who wrote about Jesus's life, but say Kazantzakis, for instance, or The Last Temptation of Christ. I remember being in a Jesuit community where it was on the shelf, so I just picked it up, and I actually enjoyed the literature a lot when I read it, and I thought, oh, it's not as scandalous as what I heard about it. So.
No, there's a lot of fiction on Jesus, but I was really looking at like Jesus in fiction written by Jewish authors, and there have been a lot of Jewish poets and a lot of Jewish authors who have used Jesus as a symbol and as a literary figure in their work, especially back in the 1800s and the 1900s, to sort of talk about Jewish identity. And yeah, it's fascinating, because I like, there is there have been I mentioned Abraham Geiger, who did write about Jesus, and there was this movement to sort of reclaim Jesus as a part of Jewish history. But the fiction side of things, it's not often talked about, because yeah, but there's actually a lot of stuff on Jesus in especially in Yiddish and in Hebrew, in fact. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to see how. And I was also planning to look at Muslim authors to see if they had written about Jesus in fiction from that perspective. But so far, I can only think of a couple of people. I should probably look into that more.
There is Naguib Mahfouz.
Yes, but it's not an explicit. Yeah, it's not really. There's actually an Arab poet. I'm forgetting his name. Is back in the 14th century, who wrote this very liberation theology kind of poem in Arabic.
A Christian or a Muslim?
He was a Muslim, and it's very good. I can't think of his name. Yeah. But even if you look at Jewish art, like Marc Chagall would be a very popular artist to have used Jesus as around the same time. In fact, Sholem Asch and Marc Chagall were very good friends, and they almost started writing about. Asch started writing about Jesus, and Chagall started painting Jesus around the same time.
So we had a small but very attentive audience. Do you have any questions in the 3 minutes left before we go back to the plenary?
Attentive, yes, it was really engaging. The only thing I have to say is how much I enjoyed each of you and appreciated the different worlds that you opened up for me. It was great fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe I could just mention very quickly about Joyce. He acknowledged Dante as almost as important for him as the Bible. And when you were speaking of Aquinas, Aquinas really mattered, and he knew his Aquinas extremely well from his early training, both with the Jesuits and in UCD. And one thing that needs to be borne in mind about Beckett and Joyce is that they were both graduates in Italian. And Dante was not a book that they dipped into at some later stage of life. They were both extremely good at Italian, and Dante was a very important text for them. Both acknowledged it, and I mean, in Beckett's theatre, but not just the theatre, it's extremely obvious. And it is also very much in Ulysses. So I just wanted to mention that, because the whole idea of religion is there. I mean, the Bible is almost his foundation, and authors like Dante, for him, mattered, and Aquinas, so that it's all really part of a jigsaw, which makes a lot of sense with what you were saying. I felt it was very valid. So thank you. And also I'm very grateful to those who have introduced me to two authors I had never heard of. And that is also, I'll definitely read The Nazarene. I have some reservations maybe about Carew, in the economy of what is left of time and other commitments. But yeah, it's great. So thank you very much. I've learned a lot from all of this.
Thank you.